Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
Namfebe troops. 3 cross-border operations. Over Ba-Trum insurgents arrested, dozens killed. Burkina Faso is no longer just holding the line, it's pushing it forward. But here's the part most headlines missed. This isn't just war. This is strategy. This is identity. And at the center of it all is a Ba-Mui Sao-year-old soldier turned head of state standing toe-to-toe with the forces that fractured an entire region. In the Sahel, where international missions have failed and villages once vanished overnight, Burkina Faso is doing something different. No foreign playbooks, no borrowed scripts, just boots on the ground, decisions made fast, and a doctrine born from survival. And yet, this story doesn't open with victory. It begins in silence. Roads cut off by landmines, towns swallowed by fear, and families unsure if they'd survive the night. The shift didn't come from the air, it came from within. So what changed, and who made that change possible? Meet Ibrahim Traoré. Not a career politician, not a general backed by global coalitions, just a man with dust on his boots and a plan in his head to take Burkina Faso back, inch by inch. Before you decide what Africa can or can't do, watch what it's already doing. Because this isn't a plea for help, it's a message. We're not waiting. Now, as the front lines expand and entire regions begin to recover, the question isn't whether Traoré can hold the ground, it's what comes next, just beyond the smoke. No one really notices when the roads go quiet. No cars, no bikes, no footsteps, just wind, dust, and the sound of absence. That's what parts of Burkina Faso became. Entire regions turned ghostly, not by nature, but by fear. Insurgent groups didn't just invade, they isolated. They laid mines beneath village paths. They blocked convoys. They took away not just territory, but time, days, weeks, even months of stalled aid and silence. Imagine knowing your child needs medicine and the nearest clinic is now a war zone. Not a hypothetical. That was daily life in the eastern, northern, and central zones. Families stopped planting crops. Farmers abandoned land they'd worked for generations. Because who risks sowing seeds in soil that could explode? We often think of conflict in body counts, but sometimes the real cost is in what people stop believing they can do: go to school, sleep through the night, give birth in peace. So how did a state on the brink of collapse begin to push back? It wasn't with speeches, it started with motion. Military units began threading through forested corridors, headlights off, radio silent. Supply lines reopened, not always safely, not always fully, but enough to remind people they weren't forgotten. Convoys, both civilian and armed, returned to the roads. And yes, it came at a cost. One humanitarian operation near the Mono River Bridge turned into a deadly standoff. Over 130 vehicles were targeted. IEDs buried in silence lit up the earth. Soldiers died trying to protect medicine and food. But they kept moving. In places like Daibo, patrols intercepted fast-striking insurgents on motorbikes, a tactic designed to overwhelm and vanish. But this time, the bikers didn't vanish. They were outmaneuvered. 4 units neutralized in a single sweep. It's not glamorous, it's not trending, but it's happening, and that's what makes it worth telling, because if one of the most unstable regions on the continent can fight back without waiting for the world's permission, what's stopping others? Hey, if you've made it this far, you're not just watching news, you're following a transformation. So hit that like, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, but because the next moves matter. And this was just the first step. The deeper shift came when soldiers stopped just defending roads and started reclaiming lives. When civilians start becoming the eyes and ears of a military, something has changed. For years, villagers in northern Burkina Faso stayed quiet, not because they didn't care, but because speaking up often meant disappearing. But now, they're passing coordinates, they're tipping off patrols, they're fighting back with information. In Dao, it wasn't drones or satellites that spotted a major insurgent hub, it was people. Locals who'd lost brothers, neighbors, whole harvests, finally deciding enough was enough. With their help, soldiers launched 3 rapid strikes. 40 terrorists eliminated, a key fuel depot destroyed. the kind of target that keeps an enemy moving and fed. That matters. Because in a war like this, where enemies don't wear uniforms and borders don't mean safety, supply lines are lifelines for both sides. But here's a harder truth. For every success, there's a cost. In Barcelo, after a deadly ambush on civilian defense volunteers, a counterattack was launched. 9 insurgents were killed, but not before an armored vehicle struck a buried explosive. 2 soldiers died on the spot. 3 more were injured. And if we're honest, there's no clean way to fight a war like this. You win ground, you lose blood, you gain intel, you lose sleep. Still, something has shifted. There's less hesitation in the ranks, more coordination in the field, and maybe more importantly, more belief among civilians that this fight is theirs too. We tend to underestimate what happens when ordinary people begin to believe they're part of the outcome. They risk more, they protect each other more, and sometimes they become the reason an entire offensive doesn't fall apart. It's not perfect, but in a place that's seen more retreats than victories, that kind of momentum feels like a turning point. And just as local intel began to shape small battles, larger operations were quietly being set in motion, not just within Burkina Faso, but across borders once used to divide. You don't name a military campaign Otapuanu unless you mean business. In the local language, it means the storm. And for insurgents in eastern and northern Burkina Faso, that's exactly what it felt like. Operation Otapuanu 3 wasn't designed to be symbolic. It was built to be surgical. Targeted strikes swept through high-risk zones like PMA and Tawari, areas that hadn't seen a government vehicle, let alone a convoy, in months. Insurgents had burrowed into these forested zones, setting up ambush nests and using dense terrain as camouflage. But this time, the ground didn't protect them. Elite units under Traoré's command executed multi-pronged attacks. They didn't wait for better weather. They didn't wait for perfect conditions. They moved in waves, clearing paths, reopening key roads, and regaining control over essential routes. For the first time in months, aid trucks rolled back into villages that were starving in silence. Children lined up for food instead of hiding from gunfire. And something almost forgotten returned to those communities. Rhythm, the rhythm of markets reopening, of mothers cooking in daylight again, of schools ringing their morning bells. We don't often measure the success of a military operation by the number of classrooms that reopen. But maybe we should, because if a storm can come and go in a matter of hours, the aftermath is what tells the truth. And this aftermath was different. Of course, there were losses on both sides. Fighters loyal to extremist groups fought back hard, some to the last round. But when the smoke cleared, the flags still flying weren't black. They were national. And that matters. It matters to the families who can now bury their loved ones properly. It matters to teachers who stayed behind, refusing to abandon their posts. It matters to soldiers who've been told for years that reclaiming these zones was too complicated. It wasn't too complicated. It was just waiting for someone to try. If you think this kind of operation should be in global headlines, make it louder. Like this video, share it, and hit subscribe, because this story won't get told unless people like you help carry it further. And Otapuanu 3, that was just the beginning of something bigger, not just in strategy, but in who showed up to fight. You know it's serious when 3 countries stop drawing borders and start drawing plans. Operation Kundugu 4 wasn't just a campaign. It was a shift in the balance of power across the Sahel. For the first time, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger launched a synchronized offensive under a new alliance, AES. It wasn't driven by outside forces, no United Nations contingents, no NATO blueprint, just local command, local intel, and a shared threat. And here's the thing, Burkina Faso didn't show up quietly. It led the charge, with the largest deployment of troops. Over 2,500 soldiers, more than 800 ground vehicles, all moving across center-east, center-south, and southwest zones. The goal? Flush out embedded insurgents, dismantle logistics routes, and rip the roots out of smuggling operations feeding the war. What they found was worse than expected. Camps stocked with explosives for IEDs, assault rifles by the dozen, and a steady trail of narcotics used not for addiction, but for financing bloodshed. Think about that. If a bag of drugs can become a bullet and a fuel tank can turn into a firebomb, what does it take to cut that supply chain for good? Over 300 suspects were arrested, many already on intelligence watch lists, and more than weapons were seized. Fuel depots were destroyed, Makeshift barter markets where militants traded stolen goods for intel were dismantled. But here's where it hits deeper. Insurgents weren't just facing bullets. They were facing coordination. They realized for the first time they weren't being chased by one nation. They were being hunted by a united front. That's not just a tactical blow, that's psychological. The kind that turns fear back on the ones who once weaponized it. And if you've ever wondered what solidarity looks like in combat, it looks like joint units moving across 3 flags. No hierarchy, just mission. Of course, victories like these come with questions. How long can this cooperation hold? Can it adapt faster than insurgent cells evolve? Can local leadership resist the temptation to turn success into politics? We don't know all the answers, but what we do know is this. For once, Africa isn't waiting on international solutions. It's building its own, with or without permission. And while Operation Kundugu proved the power of numbers, what came next revealed something even more potent: purpose. Some battles are fought with bullets, others with bread, medicine, and time. Operation Kiadima didn't just roll out tanks, it rolled out over 130 trucks, not with weapons, but with supplies, food, water, vaccines, bandages, and this time, the Cobra battalions weren't just clearing threats, they were clearing space for life to return. National Route 4 had been a death corridor. Booby traps, fake checkpoints, whole convoys had vanished trying to push through, but Kiadima changed that. Cobra forces moved mile by mile, defusing IEDs, flushing out hidden fighters, securing ambush zones, not just to gain ground, but to open a path for aid. In towns like Namunu and Bougie, the arrival of those convoys wasn't just a logistical win, it was emotional. Some hadn't seen outside help in half a year. What does that do to a town? To its spirit? We think about these things in maps and stats, but what about the feeling of hearing a diesel engine again, not from an enemy, but from someone bringing help? In one stretch, soldiers towed a broken-down civilian truck carrying essential minerals, 3 hours under fire. No one would have blamed them for leaving it, but they didn't. And maybe that's the difference here. You can teach tactics, you can train squads, but you can't manufacture resolve. Either a unit believes in the people they're protecting, or they don't. This campaign didn't just crush insurgent logistics, it cracked open something softer: trust. Villagers came out, markets reopened, health teams began treating wounds that had gone unattended for weeks. It's easy to say we fight to win. Harder to mean it when winning means rebuilding what war erased, and if you ask anyone who was there, they'll tell you Kiadima wasn't just a mission, it was a message. We're not just here to fight, we're here to restore. And while aid convoys reached the unreachable, something else was becoming just as clear. This leadership wasn't operating from behind desks, it was stepping forward, boots on the same dirt. You can't lead from the back when the front line is this close. Ibrahim Traoré doesn't send orders from a palace. He walks the routes himself, sleeps in field camps, talks to villagers, not in press conferences, but in the rubble of their schools. It's not optics, it's proximity, and it's changing how people view leadership in real time. Before he was head of state, Traoré was the guy running point on the country's earliest counter-terror ops in the north. No title, just results. That reputation, the one earned on dirt roads, not red carpets, is now shaping a national doctrine. And it's not just about who fights, it's about how. Under Traoré, the military strategy evolved. More intelligence-based raids, more post-operation stabilization, less reactive, more intentional. You don't just clear a zone, you follow up. You rebuild. And maybe that's what sets this apart. In most conflicts, power ends up centralizing around big speeches and empty gestures. But what if power could look like walking through a burned-out clinic and asking, "What do you need today, not 6 months from now?" That's not just smart politics, that's human. His most daring move? Forging the AES alliance. Not as a favor to outside powers, but as a region saying, we'll handle our own defense. We all know how many international efforts have failed in the Sahel. Big budgets, bigger promises, little staying power. But Traoré's doctrine, it doesn't wait. It acts. Even when the odds are lopsided. Even when the wins don't make the headlines. We think sometimes the West forgets what it looks like when leadership is earned on the ground, not bought or inherited. And maybe that's why this resonates. because behind the numbers, behind the operations, is something we don't always see from the outside. A leader who doesn't just command respect, but lives inside the consequences of every decision he makes. That's not common. That's not global norm. That's rare, and rare deserves attention. If this part of the story shifts how you think about leadership, don't scroll past, drop a comment, share it with someone who's never heard of Traoré, because the world hears enough noise. What it needs more of are signals that real change is possible. And while this leadership holds the center, it's what happens in the forgotten corners of the country that will test whether this model holds. Some victories look like front-page headlines. Others look like markets reopening in silence. After months of combat operations, something unexpected started happening in the most fragile places. People came back. In towns like Takwalu and Majari, once gutted by insurgents, children are laughing again. Not because everything's fine, but because something worse finally left. Vaccination stations popped up where sniper nests once stood. Makeshift health tents, staffed by army medics, began treating villagers who'd gone weeks without so much as painkillers. And yes, there are still scars, but there's rhythm now. And when a place that's known only retreat starts to find rhythm again, you pay attention. Supply drops, by air, by convoy, sometimes on foot, have made their way into previously unreachable areas. We're not talking just food, we're talking solar panels, chalkboards, midwife kits, and maybe that's the difference between reclaiming land and reclaiming life. It's easy to underestimate what dignity means in places stripped of it for years, but when a leader insists no cargo is left behind, no civilian, no grain sack, no broken down truck, it does something. Not just to morale, but to memory. Because when people remember who stood by them, they also remember who didn't. We can debate strategy, we can argue over geopolitics, but the human truth is this: people don't forget when someone finally showed up and stayed. And here's what we think. If leadership can be this grounded, this close to the dirt, this stubborn in its protection of ordinary lives, then maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Not can fragile nations survive, but what happens when they decide they won't be fragile anymore? That shift doesn't happen on paper. It happens in the smell of a reopened bakery, in the sound of a child spelling their name for the first time in a classroom that almost didn't reopen, in the eyes of a medic who treated 20 patients with 6 bandages and still came back the next day. The front line has moved, not just geographically, but emotionally. And if that holds, then maybe, just maybe, Burkina Faso isn't a headline anymore. It's a blueprint. At the end of the day, this kind of story isn't just about tactics or troop counts. It's about what people choose to rebuild once the dust settles. And maybe that says more about a country than any headline ever could. This content isn't about glorifying conflict. It's about documenting what happens when a nation decides to write its own script, even when the world's not watching. Personally, I don't think there are perfect answers here. I'm not saying Traoré's approach is flawless, but from where I'm sitting, it feels like a rare moment where leadership and community are actually pulling in the same direction. And that's worth paying attention to, whether you agree with the strategy or not. If this gave you something to think about or helped you see a different angle, go ahead and subscribe, leave a comment, or share it with someone who never hears stories like this. The next update's coming soon. Different place, same region, and once again, worth your time. See you there.